In the gleaming offices of Silicon Valley's apex capital, a young data analyst was about to challenge one of tech's most charismatic CEOs. What started as routine financial analysis took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a $400 million fraud that would shake the entire investment industry. Lily Jenkins wasn't your typical corporate whistleblower. For 3 months, she had spent her life meticulously documenting evidence, while being systematically silenced in every company meeting, known for her unwavering determination to protect innocent investors. When she encountered Marcus Sterling's sophisticated Ponzi scheme hidden beneath Silicon Valley innovation, she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would cost her career but save thousands of families from financial ruin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Lily Jenkins pressed her badge against the glass turnstile and stepped into the gleaming lobby of Apex Capital, her heart hammering with the kind of nervous excitement she hadn't felt since graduation day. The space embodied everything she'd dreamed Silicon Valley would be: soaring ceilings, living walls of emerald moss, and sleek workstations where brilliant minds shaped the future of finance. After 2 years of grinding through entry-level positions at faceless corporations, she'd finally made it to somewhere that mattered. "Welcome to the revolution," said Marcus Sterling as he emerged from the elevator bank, his smile as perfectly calibrated as his tailored shirt. At 38, the CEO carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. His handshake was firm, his eye contact unwavering, and when he spoke about democratizing investing for the masses, Lily found herself leaning forward, caught in the gravitational pull of his vision. "We're not just another fintech startup," Marcus continued, guiding her through the open workspace, where developers hunched over screens displaying real-time market data. "We're giving ordinary people the same tools that Wall Street has hoarded for decades. Teachers, nurses, mechanics, they deserve better than watching their savings stagnate in some big bank's checking account." Lily nodded, thinking of her parents' modest savings account back in Ohio, earning a pitiful 0.01% interest. Her father had worked double shifts at the steel mill to pay for her college education, and her mother had cleaned houses on weekends, their hands cracked and calloused so that Lily could sit in lecture halls learning about derivatives and portfolio theory. The idea of leveling that playing field made her chest tight with purpose. "Your background in data analytics is exactly what we need," Marcus said as they approached a cluster of monitors displaying colorful charts and graphs. "Too many companies make decisions based on gut feelings and boardroom politics. We let the numbers tell the story." He introduced her to the analytics team, a mix of recent graduates and seasoned professionals, who welcomed her with the easy camaraderie of people who genuinely enjoyed their work. Rebecca Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman barely out of business school, gave her a quick tour of the data visualization tools they used. The sophistication of their systems impressed Lily. She'd be working with real-time feeds from major exchanges, machine learning algorithms that could spot market trends before human analysts even noticed them. "The Q3 reports are your first major project," explained her supervisor, gesturing toward a stack of documents that represented months of investor activity. "Marcus wants a deep dive into our performance metrics before the board meeting next week." As Lily settled into her new workspace, a standing desk with dual monitors overlooking the bustling open floor, she felt the familiar thrill of diving into fresh data. Numbers had always made sense to her in a way that people sometimes didn't. They followed logical patterns, revealed hidden truths, told stories that words couldn't capture. The Q3 financial data painted an impressive picture: consistent growth, diversified portfolios, and returns that outpaced traditional investment vehicles. Apex was clearly fulfilling its promise to deliver superior results for everyday investors. But as Lily dug deeper, her trained eye began to notice tiny inconsistencies. Nothing alarming, just small discrepancies in fund allocations that didn't quite align with the stated investment strategies. She was puzzling over a particularly odd pattern in the International Equity Fund when David Park appeared at her elbow. The senior analyst was in his mid-40s, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen multiple boom and bust cycles. Unlike the other employees who seemed energized by the company's rapid growth, David carried himself with a certain wariness. "Finding everything you need?" he asked, glancing at her screen. "Just getting oriented," Lily replied. "These international allocations are interesting. Some of the subsidiary investments seem pretty aggressive for a balanced growth fund." David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Apex has always pushed boundaries. Marcus believes conservative strategies are what keep ordinary investors poor. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Just remember that sometimes the most important questions are the ones that don't get asked in meetings." Before Lily could respond, David had moved on, leaving her with the uncomfortable sensation that he'd been trying to tell her something without actually saying it. She turned back to her screen, but the numbers suddenly felt less straightforward, as if they were hiding something just beyond her understanding. The rest of her first day passed in a blur of introductions and system tutorials. As evening approached and the office began to empty, Lily found herself alone with her data, cross-referencing fund performance against stated investment criteria. The discrepancies were still there, small enough to be explained away as rounding errors or timing differences, but persistent enough to nag at her analytical instincts. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How was the first day, sweetheart?" Lily smiled and stepped outside to call home. The California air was warm and sweet with the scent of eucalyptus, so different from the industrial haze of her hometown. When her parents answered, their voices crackling through her father's ancient flip phone, she felt a familiar surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. "It's incredible, Mom. The office looks like something from a movie. And my boss, the CEO himself, personally welcomed me. They're doing exactly what you always said someone should do, helping regular people build real wealth." Her mother's pride was audible across the miles. "We knew you'd find somewhere special. Your father and I were just saying how glad we are that all those late nights studying paid off." After hanging up, Lily sat on a bench outside the Apex building, watching the last commuters heading home. The weight of her parents' sacrifices settled on her shoulders like a familiar coat. This job wasn't just about her career. It was vindication of every overtime shift her father had worked, every weekend her mother had spent scrubbing other people's bathrooms. She'd finally made it to a place where she could make a real difference. As she gathered her things to leave, Lily glanced back at the Q3 data on her screen. The discrepancies still bothered her, but perhaps David was right. Maybe she was overthinking things. Apex was a fast-growing company operating in complex markets. A few minor inconsistencies were probably inevitable. Still, as she walked to her car, Lily found herself thinking about those subsidiary investments, the way certain fund allocations didn't quite match their stated purposes. Numbers didn't lie, but they could certainly be made to tell different stories depending on how you arrange them. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd dig a little deeper. After all, Marcus had hired her for her analytical skills. The least she could do was use them properly. The morning light streaming through Apex's floor-to-ceiling windows felt different as Lily settled at her desk 3 weeks later. What had once seemed like golden optimism now carried an edge of scrutiny as she opened the financial files that had kept her awake the previous night. Those small discrepancies she'd noticed on her first day had grown into a pattern that made her stomach clench with unease. She'd spent the weekend running calculations from her apartment, double-checking her methodology against textbook examples, convinced she must be making some fundamental error. But the numbers remained stubbornly inconsistent. The Apex Growth Fund, marketed to conservative investors seeking steady returns, showed investment patterns that defied its stated strategy. Money that should have been flowing into blue-chip stocks and government bonds was somehow finding its way into high-risk derivatives and offshore accounts. "Morning, Lily." Rebecca Martinez appeared with 2 cups of coffee, her usual bright smile tinged with something that looked like concern. "You've been here late every night this week. Everything okay?" Lily accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Rebecca's eyes drifted toward the spreadsheets covering her monitors. "Just trying to get up to speed. There's a lot to learn about how Apex structures its investments." "Tell me about it." Rebecca lowered her voice, glancing around the open workspace. "Sometimes I feel like I need a PhD in financial engineering just to understand what we're actually selling to people." The comment hung between them, and Lily sensed an opening. Have you ever noticed anything unusual about the fund allocations? Like money not going where the prospectus says it should? Rebecca's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. I mean, Marcus always says we're pioneering new approaches. Maybe traditional categories don't apply to what we're doing? But her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Lily. Before Lily could respond, her supervisor, James Chen, approached with a stack of reports. Good morning, ladies. Lily, I need you to shift focus to the client satisfaction surveys. The board wants demographic breakdowns for next week's presentation. Actually, I wanted to discuss something about the Q3 analysis first, Lily said, her pulse quickening. I've found some discrepancies in the fund allocations that I think… Discrepancies? James's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's a strong word. What kind of discrepancies? Lily pulled up her analysis, pointing to the highlighted cells where projected investments diverged from actual fund movements. The growth fund shows $15.7 million allocated to what's listed as, quote, international bonds. But when I trace the money, it's actually going to a subsidiary called Meridian Holdings that doesn't appear in any of our investment documentation. James studied the screen, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. Lily, you have to understand that Apex operates with a level of sophistication that can seem confusing at first. These subsidiary structures are perfectly legal. They're just advanced portfolio management techniques. But shouldn't they be disclosed to investors? The prospectus clearly states. The prospectus covers the essential information. James's voice carried a note of finality. Look, I appreciate your thoroughness, but Marcus didn't hire you to question our fundamental business model. He hired you to analyze client data and support our growth initiatives. I'd suggest focusing on the tasks you've been assigned. The dismissal stung more than Lily had expected. She watched James walk away, leaving her staring at the numbers that seemed to mock her from the screen. Rebecca had disappeared during the conversation, and Lily found herself alone with her doubts and a growing sense of isolation. The all-hands meeting that afternoon provided her first opportunity to observe Marcus in action with the entire company. He commanded the room effortlessly, his presentation about Q3 performance peppered with inspiring anecdotes about families whose lives had been transformed by Apex's services. But when the CFO, Jennifer Walsh, mentioned adjusted returns for compliance purposes, Marcus smoothly redirected the conversation to future growth targets. As always, our priority is maximizing value for our investors while maintaining full regulatory compliance, Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room. For a brief moment, his gaze settled on Lily, and she felt an uncomfortable chill. We're disrupting an industry that's grown complacent, and that means we can't be afraid to push boundaries. During the Q&A session, a developer raised a question about the technical infrastructure supporting their international investments. Marcus's answer was masterful, comprehensive enough to sound authoritative while remaining vague enough to avoid specifics. Lily noticed how Jennifer Walsh shifted uncomfortably when the topic of overseas accounts came up, her fingers drumming against her tablet. After the meeting, Lily found herself walking to the elevator beside David Park. The senior analyst had been quieter than usual during the presentation, and she sensed he might share her concerns. Inspiring stuff, she said carefully. David pressed the elevator button and waited until they were alone before responding. Marcus has always been gifted at painting big pictures. Sometimes the details get lost in all that vision. What kind of details? The elevator doors opened, and David stepped aside to let her enter first. The kind that matter to the people whose money we're managing. He looked directly at her. You've been asking good questions, Lily. Don't stop asking them just because the answers make people uncomfortable. That evening, Lily remained at her desk long after most of her colleagues had left. The building's ambient lighting cast long shadows across the workspace, and the silence felt oppressive. She opened a new spreadsheet and began documenting everything she'd discovered, not just the financial inconsistencies, but the reactions they'd provoked. The pattern was becoming clearer. Money was flowing into Apex from thousands of small investors seeking safe, steady returns. But instead of being invested according to stated strategies, significant portions were being funneled through a network of subsidiary companies with opaque purposes. The profits generated by these hidden investments weren't flowing back to the original investors. They were being used to pay returns to earlier investors while funding Apex's aggressive expansion. It looked disturbingly like a Ponzi scheme dressed up in Silicon Valley sophistication. Lily's hands trembled as she saved the file to an encrypted folder on her personal laptop. She thought about her parents, about Thomas Bradley, and the thousands of other ordinary people who trusted Apex with their life savings. They deserved to know where their money was really going. But she also thought about her career, her student loans, and the precarious position she'd found herself in after only 3 weeks on the job. James had made it clear that her concerns weren't welcome, and Marcus's penetrating stare during the meeting suggested he was already aware of her questions. As she gathered her things to leave, Rebecca appeared at her desk, looking nervous. "Hey, I wanted to apologize for earlier. When you were talking to James about those allocation issues, I should have backed you up." "It's okay," Lily said, though she appreciated the gesture. "It's not okay, actually." Rebecca glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I've noticed things too. Inconsistencies in the client reporting, gaps in the documentation, but everyone here acts like questioning anything makes you disloyal to the mission." For the first time in weeks, Lily felt less alone. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Rebecca pulled up a chair, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Client statements that don't match the underlying investment data, returns that seem too good to be true, and the way certain emails mysteriously disappear from the system after board meetings." As they compared notes, Lily realized her suspicions were just the tip of an iceberg. The question was no longer whether something was wrong at Apex. It was how deep the deception went, and whether she had the courage to find out. Walking to her car under the dim parking lot lights, Lily made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would start building a real case, documenting every discrepancy with the methodical precision that had gotten her this far. If Apex was defrauding its investors, someone needed to expose the truth. Even if that someone was a first-generation college graduate who'd barely been there a month. The numbers didn't lie. Now she just had to prove it. The numbers didn't lie. The realization echoed in Lily's mind as she walked into Apex the following Monday morning, her encrypted laptop bag feeling heavier than usual. She'd spent the weekend organizing her evidence into a comprehensive analysis that painted a disturbing picture of systematic fraud. Now, as she badged into the building that had once seemed like a temple to innovation, every gleaming surface felt like a facade hiding something rotten. "Lily, perfect timing." Marcus Sterling's voice cut through her thoughts as he approached her desk, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits she didn't recognize. "I'd like you to join our investor presentation this morning. Your analytical perspective would be valuable." The invitation felt more like a command, and Lily found herself nodding despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. As they walked toward the executive conference room, Marcus's hand on her shoulder felt less like mentorship and more like a leash. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as a dozen Apex employees prepared for the video call with potential investors. Lily recognized the setup from her previous companies: multiple cameras, professional lighting, and a carefully choreographed presentation designed to inspire confidence. She took her assigned seat at the far end of the table, noting how her chair was positioned slightly outside the main camera frame. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began as the call connected, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned performer. "Thank you for considering Apex Capital as your investment partner. We're not just offering superior returns, we're offering a revolution in how ordinary Americans build wealth." The presentation unfolded with slick precision. Charts showed impressive growth trajectories, testimonials from satisfied clients played on cue, and Marcus fielded questions with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. When an investor asked about risk management protocols, Marcus gestured toward Lily. "Our senior data analyst can speak to our sophisticated monitoring systems." Lily? This was her moment. She could expose the discrepancies, reveal the offshore accounts, force the truth into the light. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she realized she'd been muted. Her microphone icon showed a red slash, and despite pressing the unmute button repeatedly, no sound emerged. "I'm sorry," Marcus said smoothly, not looking at her. "We seem to have a technical issue. Let me address that question myself." He launched into a detailed explanation of Apex's risk assessment algorithms, none of which matched the actual systems Lily had been studying. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized what had happened. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was intentional. Marcus had brought her into the meeting not to contribute, but to be silenced in front of witnesses. The message was crystal clear. "Your voice doesn't matter here." After the call ended and the room emptied, Lily remained seated, staring at her muted microphone icon. Rebecca approached cautiously, her face etched with concern. "That was weird," Rebecca whispered. "I've never seen the system malfunction like that before." "It wasn't a malfunction," Lily said quietly. The realization settled between them like a cold weight. Rebecca glanced toward the door where Marcus had exited, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding. That afternoon brought another blow. Lily arrived at the quarterly planning meeting to find her usual seat taken by a new hire from the marketing department. When she asked James Chen about the change, he barely looked up from his laptop. "Oh, we decided to shift the focus to client acquisition strategies. Your expertise isn't really needed for this particular session." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through the glass conference room walls, Lily watched her colleagues discuss investment strategies that she should have been evaluating. Jennifer Walsh caught her eye at one point, her expression unreadable before she quickly looked away. The exclusion felt deliberate, surgical in its precision. By Thursday, the pattern had crystallized into something undeniable. Email chains she should have been included on mysteriously stopped reaching her inbox. Meetings she'd attended for weeks suddenly had quote, capacity constraints. Her access to certain financial databases was quietly restricted, requiring supervisor approval for data she'd previously accessed freely. The breaking point came during a team video call about Q4 projections. Lily had prepared extensively, ready to present her analysis of concerning trends in client retention. But when she tried to speak, the same muted microphone icon appeared. This time, she watched James deliberately click her audio off from his admin controls. "Let's keep this focused on actionable insights," James said, his meaning unmistakable. That evening, Lily sat in her car in the Apex parking garage, her hands shaking as she called David Park. He'd left the company 6 months earlier, but his warning about asking uncomfortable questions suddenly felt prophetic. "Lily? How are things at Apex?" "Not good, David. You were right about the questions that don't get asked in meetings. I've been asking them, and now—" Her voice caught. "Now they're making sure I can't ask them anymore." A long pause followed. When David spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that suggested he'd been expecting this call. "What have you found?" Lily outlined her discoveries: the misallocated funds, the offshore subsidiaries, the pattern that looked increasingly like a Ponzi scheme. David listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of recognition. "How much are we talking about?" he asked finally. "Minimum $50 million in the funds I can still access, but if the pattern holds across all their investment vehicles—" She did the math quickly. "It could be hundreds of millions." Jesus. David was quiet for a moment. "Lily, I need to tell you something. The reason I left wasn't just about being ignored in meetings. I found similar discrepancies last year. Smaller scale, but the same basic structure. When I tried to raise concerns with Marcus directly, I was offered a very generous severance package and a very comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The implication hit her like ice water. You think they'll try to buy my silence? If you're lucky. Marcus doesn't like loose ends, and he's got too much riding on Apex's success to let anyone threaten it. Be very careful about what you document and where you store it." After hanging up, Lily sat in the darkened garage, processing the weight of David's warning. She thought about her parents, who called every Sunday to hear about her dream job. She thought about her student loans, her rent, and the career she'd worked so hard to build. Most of all, she thought about the thousands of investors who trusted Apex with their life savings, while Marcus Sterling built his empire on systematic fraud. That night, She began keeping detailed records of her treatment at work. Every muted microphone, every excluded meeting, every access restriction went into an encrypted file alongside her financial analysis. If Marcus wanted to silence her, she'd document every attempt. She also started researching federal whistleblower protections and financial crime reporting procedures. The FBI's website outlined clear processes for reporting securities fraud, but reading the warnings about potential retaliation made her stomach churn. People who reported financial crimes often faced professional exile, legal harassment, and personal threats. But as she reviewed her evidence one more time, looking at the millions of dollars being siphoned away from unsuspecting investors, Lily felt her resolve hardening. Her parents had raised her to believe that doing the right thing mattered more than personal comfort. They'd sacrificed everything so she could have opportunities they'd never had. Now she had an opportunity to protect people just like them. The next morning, Lily arrived at work with a new sense of purpose. If Marcus wanted a war of attrition, she'd give him one. She would document every piece of evidence, record every instance of retaliation, and build a case so comprehensive that even the most sophisticated legal team couldn't tear it apart. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would she. As she settled at her desk, she noticed a new email from IT about routine security updates to employee laptops. The timing felt suspicious, but Lily just smiled grimly and began her day. Her real evidence was safely encrypted on personal devices Marcus's people would never find. Let the games begin. Let the games begin. The words echoed in Lily's mind as she watched the IT technician install security updates on her work laptop, his fingers dancing across keys with practiced efficiency. She smiled politely and made small talk about system performance while mentally cataloging every keystroke. Marcus might control her work computer, but her real investigation lived elsewhere, encrypted and hidden in devices he'd never touch. 3 weeks into her covert operation, Lily had developed the methodical routine of a spy. She arrived early each morning, performed her assigned tasks with dutiful competence, and stayed late to conduct her real work. The Apex offices after hours felt different. Shadows stretched longer, conversations carried further, and the building's ambitious daytime energy gave way to something more honest and revealing. Tonight was no different. The cleaning crew had finished their rounds, security was light, and most employees had long since departed for their expensive cars and overpriced apartments. Lily sat at her desk, ostensibly reviewing client satisfaction surveys, while her personal tablet, hidden beneath a stack of reports, displayed her growing database of evidence. The scope of the fraud had become staggering. What began as suspicious fund allocations had metastasized into a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and falsified investment records. She'd identified at least 12 subsidiary entities that existed solely to shuffle money between accounts, creating the illusion of legitimate investment activity while actually funding Marcus's lavish lifestyle and Apex's aggressive expansion. The elevator chimed softly, and Lily quickly minimized her tablet screen. Jennifer Walsh emerged, looking harried and carrying an armload of files. The CFO rarely worked this late, and her presence sent a spike of adrenaline through Lily's system. Their eyes met across the dimly lit workspace, and for a moment, neither woman moved. Jennifer's expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been relief. She approached Lily's desk slowly, as if crossing a minefield. Working late again? Jennifer's voice carried none of its usual corporate authority. Instead, she sounded tired, almost defeated. Client surveys, Lily replied carefully. Marcus wants comprehensive demographic analysis before the next board meeting. Jennifer set her files down and pulled up a chair, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Lily, can I ask you something? Off the record? The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Lily saved her work and closed her tablet, giving Jennifer her full attention. Of course! What did you study in college? Before you specialized in financial analysis? The unexpected question caught Lily off guard. Mathematics, with a minor in ethics. Why? Ethics. Jennifer repeated the word like it tasted bitter. When you took those ethics courses, did they prepare you for situations where doing the right thing could destroy everything you've worked for? Lily's pulse quickened. This felt like more than casual conversation. It felt like a confession waiting to happen. They taught me that ethical decisions are often the hardest ones to make, but that difficulty doesn't make them optional. Jennifer laughed, but there was no humor in it. Easy to say when you're young and idealistic. Harder when you're a single mother with a mortgage and a daughter who needs medical care that costs more than most people's salaries. The personal revelation hit Lily like a physical blow. She'd known Jennifer was brilliant, ambitious, and caught between competing loyalties, but she hadn't known about the daughter or the medical expenses. Suddenly, the CFO's moral compromise became painfully human. "Jennifer," Lily said gently, "what's really going on?" For a long moment, Jennifer stared at the stack of files she'd brought, her fingers drumming against the desk in a nervous rhythm. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How much do you really know about Apex's investment structure?" The question felt like a test. Lily weighed her options: deny knowledge and maintain her cover, or take the risk of trusting someone who might be an ally or a trap. David's warnings about Marcus's ruthlessness echoed in her mind, but looking at Jennifer's haunted expression, she made her choice. "I know about Meridian Holdings, Cayman Financial Services, and at least 10 other subsidiaries that don't appear in any public documentation. I know that money earmarked for conservative growth funds is being funneled through high-risk derivatives. And I know that client returns are being paid from new investor deposits rather than actual investment profits." Jennifer's face went pale. "Jesus Christ, how long have you known?" "Weeks. I've been documenting everything, building a comprehensive case." "A case for what? Internal review? Regulatory compliance?" Lily met Jennifer's gaze directly. "For federal investigators." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of consequence in all directions. Jennifer closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, looking suddenly older than her 40-something years. "You have no idea what you're getting into," Jennifer said finally. "Marcus isn't just running a fraudulent investment scheme. He's got connections to people who make corporate lawyers look like choir boys. Politicians, regulators, other financial firms. This goes way beyond Apex." "How way beyond?" Jennifer glanced around nervously before opening one of her files. Inside were bank statements, wire transfer records, and correspondence that made Lily's discoveries look like amateur hour. The documents showed a network of complicit institutions, regulatory officials who'd been bought off, and financial crimes that stretched back years. "Marcus learned from his previous downfall," Jennifer explained. "When his Wall Street firm collapsed, he lost everything because he operated alone. This time, he made sure he wasn't the only one with dirty hands. Half the venture capital firms in Silicon Valley have money flowing through Marcus's network. 3 state pension funds are invested in his schemes. Even some federal employees have retirement accounts tied to Apex subsidiaries." The implications made Lily dizzy. This wasn't just fraud. It was systemic corruption that touched thousands of investors and dozens of institutions. Exposing it would require more than her carefully documented spreadsheets. It would require allies, protection, and resources she didn't have. "Why are you telling me this?" Lily asked. Jennifer's smile was bitter. "Because I'm tired of lying to myself that this is temporary. I told myself we were just bending rules to get through a rough patch, that we'd make it right once the company stabilized. But it's been 2 years, and instead of getting better, it's getting worse. Marcus is planning to expand internationally, which means even more victims and bigger risks." She pulled out another document, a resignation letter dated for the following week. "I'm getting out before this whole thing collapses. I've got enough saved to take care of my daughter's medical needs for a few years, and I can't be part of this anymore. Jennifer, you could help me. Your insider knowledge combined with my analysis could—" "No?" The refusal was immediate and firm. "I'm not brave enough to be a whistleblower, Lily. I'm just barely brave enough to walk away. But I can tell you this. If you're serious about exposing Marcus, you need to be very careful about who you trust. He's got people watching everyone who might pose a threat." As if summoned by her words, The building's security system chimed, indicating someone had badged into the building. Both women froze, listening to footsteps echoing from the lobby. Jennifer quickly gathered her files and stood. "That conversation never happened," she whispered. "But Lily, whatever you decide to do it soon. Marcus is planning something big for the end of the quarter, and once that happens, the window for stopping this might close forever." She was gone before Lily could respond, disappearing into the elevator like a ghost bearing warnings. Alone again, Lily sat in the darkened office, processing the weight of what she'd learned. The footsteps in the lobby had faded, leaving her with the unsettling certainty that Jennifer was right about being watched. That night, Lily drove home through empty streets, checking her mirrors for following vehicles and taking random turns to ensure she wasn't being tailed. The paranoia felt surreal, like something from a thriller novel rather than her actual life. But as she parked in her apartment complex and climbed the stairs to her unit, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Inside her apartment, she updated her encrypted files with Jennifer's revelations, documenting the expanded scope of the conspiracy and the timeline Jennifer had hinted at. The end of the quarter was only 6 weeks away. Whatever Marcus was planning, she had 6 weeks to stop it. As she prepared for bed, Lily caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The idealistic young woman who'd started at Apex 2 months ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, more cautious, but also more determined. Tomorrow, she would start researching federal agencies that handled financial crimes, looking for someone she could trust, with evidence that could bring down not just Marcus Sterling, but an entire network of corruption. The numbers still didn't lie, but now she understood they were telling a much bigger story than she'd ever imagined. The numbers still didn't lie, but now she understood they were telling a much bigger story than she'd ever imagined. Lily's reflection in her bathroom mirror had haunted her through a sleepless night, and as she sat in the cramped downtown coffee shop at 7 a.m., she wondered if she looked as paranoid as she felt. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit website had been surprisingly straightforward about reporting procedures, but arranging this meeting had required 3 different burner phones and enough tradecraft to make her feel like a character in a spy novel. Detective Sarah Rodriguez didn't look like Lily's mental image of a federal agent. Petite and sharp-eyed, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she could have been a school principal or a librarian. Only the way her eyes constantly scanned the coffee shop's exits and the calculated casualness of her posture suggested her true profession. "Ms. Jenkins?" Sarah's voice carried a slight accent that spoke of working-class roots. "Thank you for reaching out. Your message was intriguing." Lily's hands trembled slightly as she slid a thumb drive across the small table. "Everything's on there. Financial records, organizational charts, documented instances of fraud going back 2 years. It's bigger than I initially thought." Sarah pocketed the drive without examining it, her expression remaining neutral. "Tell me about your role at Apex Capital." "Senior data analyst. I started 3 months ago, noticed discrepancies in investment allocations almost immediately." Lily kept her voice low, acutely aware of the other customers around them. "At first I thought it was just poor record-keeping, but the pattern became undeniable. They're running a Ponzi scheme disguised as innovative investment strategies." "Ponzi schemes aren't unusual in fintech," Sarah said carefully. "What makes you think this case warrants federal attention?" Lily had prepared for this question. "Because it's not just Apex. The fraud involves multiple financial institutions, state pension funds, and at least 12 offshore subsidiaries. Conservative estimate? $400 million in misappropriated investor funds." Sarah's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. $400 million? That's just what I can document with limited access. The CFO suggested the scope is much larger, involving regulatory capture and political connections. Lily leaned forward. "Detective Rodriguez, these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. There are teachers, nurses, retirees who've invested their life savings based on fraudulent promises." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a hardening that suggested personal investment. "How did you discover the CFO's involvement?" Lily recounted her conversation with Jennifer Walsh, carefully omitting any details that might implicate the CFO as a willing participant. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small pad that appeared well used. "This Jennifer Walsh," Sarah said finally. "Is she willing to cooperate with an investigation?" "She's planning to resign next week. I don't think she'd testify voluntarily, but she has access to documents that could prove the case." Sarah nodded slowly. "Ms. Jenkins, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Are you prepared for what reporting this fraud might cost you personally?" The question hit harder than Lily had expected. "What do you mean?" Corporate whistleblowers face retaliation that goes far beyond losing their jobs. Legal harassment, blacklisting, personal threats. The financial industry has sophisticated methods for destroying people who threaten their operations. Sarah's voice carried the weight of experience. "I've seen brave individuals lose everything: careers, relationships, sometimes their safety, for doing the right thing." Lily thought about her parents, about the student loans that would follow her for decades, about the career she'd worked so hard to build. Then she thought about Thomas Bradley and the thousands of other investors trusting Marcus Sterling with their futures. "Detective Rodriguez, my parents spent their entire lives sacrificing, so I could have opportunities they never had. If I use those opportunities to protect people like them, that seems like the best possible outcome." Sarah smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Good answer. But I need you to understand that once we begin this investigation, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain about your evidence?" "I've triple-checked everything. The fraud is systematic, ongoing, and expanding." "Then let's discuss next steps." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "First, you continue working at Apex as if nothing has changed. Document everything, but don't take any risks that might expose your activities. Second, I'll need you to identify potential witnesses who might cooperate with federal investigators. Third, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "I need to take this. Don't leave." As Sarah stepped outside to answer her phone, Lily sat alone with her racing thoughts. The coffee shop's ambient noise, grinding machines, casual conversations, clinking cups, felt surreal against the magnitude of what she'd just set in motion. There really was no going back now. When Sarah returned, her expression was grim. "We may have a problem. That was my supervisor. Someone's been asking questions about you." Ice flooded Lily's veins. "What kind of questions?" "Background checks, employment verification, the kind of inquiries that suggest someone's building a file." Sarah sat down and leaned forward. "How many people know about your investigation?" "Almost no one. David Park, he's the former employee who warned me about company politics. Rebecca Martinez, a junior analyst who's noticed similar inconsistencies. Jennifer Walsh, obviously. That's it." "What about your personal life? Family, friends, anyone you might have mentioned Apex to?" Lily's stomach dropped as she realized her mistake. "My parents. I call them every Sunday, tell them about work. I mentioned finding some irregularities, but I didn't think your parents' phone line could be monitored. Corporate security firms have access to surveillance technology that rivals government capabilities." Sarah's expression was sympathetic but serious. "Marcus Sterling has significant resources and apparent connections to regulatory officials. If he's identified you as a threat, he'll use every tool available to neutralize that threat." The implications crashed over Lily like cold water. Her investigation, her conversations with Jennifer, her contact with federal authorities, all of it could be known. Marcus might be 3 steps ahead of everything she'd done. "What do I do?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "We accelerate the timeline. I'll begin the formal investigation immediately, but I need you to be extremely careful. Assume all your communications are monitored, assume you're being followed, and assume Marcus knows more than he's letting on." Sarah stood and handed Lily a business card with only a phone number written on it. "Memorize that number and destroy the card. If you feel threatened, or if anything unusual happens, call immediately. Don't use your regular phone, find a payphone, or buy a burner." As they prepared to leave separately, Sarah grabbed Lily's arm. "One more thing. You mentioned the CFO is resigning next week. that timing might not be coincidental. If Marcus is planning something significant for end of quarter, Jennifer's departure could be part of a larger strategy to limit liability. You think she's in on it? I think she's scared. Scared people make unpredictable choices. Sarah's grip tightened slightly. Watch yourself, Ms. Jenkins. You're about to find out how far powerful people will go to protect their secrets. Walking back to her car in the parking garage, Lily felt eyes on her from every shadow. The paranoia that had felt theatrical now seemed entirely justified. As she drove to work, checking her mirrors compulsively, she tried to process the morning's revelations. Someone was investigating her, which meant Marcus suspected her activities. Jennifer was leaving, potentially taking crucial evidence with her. And the federal investigation she'd initiated would now proceed whether she was ready or not. At Apex, she badged in with the same smile she'd worn for months, greeting colleagues as if nothing had changed. But as she settled at her desk and opened her assigned projects, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching her differently. The game had indeed begun. Now she just had to survive it long enough to see justice done. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Conference Room C, now. MS, Marcus Sterling wanted to see her. As Lily walked toward what felt like a trap, she reminded herself that she was no longer fighting alone. Detective Rodriguez was building a case, federal resources were being deployed, and the truth she'd uncovered would outlive whatever happened to her personally. The numbers didn't lie, and soon the whole world would know exactly what they revealed. The numbers didn't lie, and soon the whole world would know exactly what they revealed. Lily's footsteps echoed in the hallway as she approached Conference Room C, each step feeling like a countdown to confrontation. The text from Marcus had arrived with surgical timing, less than 2 hours after her meeting with Detective Rodriguez. Either the coincidence was extraordinary, or her worst fears about surveillance were true. Marcus sat alone at the polished conference table, his usual charismatic smile replaced by something harder, more calculating. The room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Silicon Valley, but today the vista felt more like a prison than a promise. "Lily, please sit." His voice carried none of its usual warmth. "We need to discuss your future at Apex?" She took the chair directly across from him, noting how he'd positioned himself with his back to the windows, forcing her to squint against the morning light. Even in private confrontation, Marcus controlled the stage. "I've been reviewing your work," he continued, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Your analytical skills are impressive, but I'm concerned about your focus." Inside the folder were printouts of her legitimate work: client demographic analyses, satisfaction surveys, performance metrics. Nothing incriminating, but the message was clear. He knew exactly what she'd been doing during business hours, which meant he probably knew what she'd been doing after hours too. "I'm not sure I understand," Lily said carefully. "James Chen tells me you've been asking questions about investment allocations that fall outside your assigned responsibilities. Jennifer Walsh mentioned you've shown unusual interest in subsidiary structures." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze never wavering from her face. "I appreciate curiosity in my employees, but there's a difference between intellectual engagement and overreach." The word hung between them like a blade. Lily felt her pulse accelerate, but forced her expression to remain neutral. "I was trying to understand how our investment strategies work so I could better analyze client outcomes." "Of course." Marcus's smile was arctic. "But here's what I think is really happening, Lily. I think you've been conducting unauthorized research into confidential business operations. I think you've been sharing sensitive company information with outside parties. And I think you've fundamentally misunderstood both your role here and the nature of our business." The accusation was delivered with such casual certainty that Lily felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble. He knew. Not just suspected, knew. The only question was how much. "Marcus, let me finish." His voice carried new authority, the kind that came from holding all the cards. Apex Capital operates in a complex regulatory environment with sophisticated investment strategies that can appear irregular to someone without proper context. What you've interpreted as irregularities are actually innovative approaches to portfolio management that have been approved by our compliance team and external auditors. The gaslighting was masterful, delivered with such confidence that Lily almost doubted her own analysis. But the numbers were burned into her memory, millions of dollars flowing through shell companies, returns paid from new investor deposits, offshore accounts with no legitimate business purpose. "I've prepared a generous severance package," Marcus continued, producing another document. 6 months' salary, full benefits continuation, and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. "All you have to do is sign, and you can leave Apex with your reputation intact and your future secure." Lily stared at the papers without touching them. "And if I don't sign?" "Then I'll be forced to conclude that you violated your employment contract by conducting unauthorized investigations and sharing confidential information. That would necessitate immediate termination for cause, with no severance and a negative employment reference that would make finding another position challenging." The threat was wrapped in corporate language, but its meaning was unmistakable. "Sign the NDA and disappear quietly, or face professional destruction." David Park had described a similar choice: take the money and stay silent, or have your career destroyed. But as Lily looked at Marcus's expectant face, she thought about Thomas Bradley and the thousands of retirees trusting their life savings to Apex's fraudulent promises. She thought about her parents, who'd sacrificed everything so she could have opportunities to make a difference. Most importantly, she thought about Detective Rodriguez, who was already building a federal case that would proceed regardless of what happened to Lily personally. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. Marcus's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, take the weekend. But Lily, understand that this offer expires Monday morning. After that, your options become significantly more limited." She gathered the documents and stood to leave, but Marcus's voice stopped her at the door. "One more thing. Your parents seem like lovely people. Salt-of-the-earth types who worked hard to give their daughter opportunities. It would be a shame if misguided choices on your part created unnecessary complications for them." The words hit her like ice water. It wasn't explicitly a threat, but the implication was clear enough. Marcus's reach extended beyond corporate retaliation into her personal life, into the lives of people she loved. "Are you threatening my family?" she asked, turning back to face him. "Of course not. I'm simply observing that your choices have consequences beyond yourself." His smile returned, but it carried new menace. "Have a good weekend, Lily." The rest of Friday passed in a haze of routine tasks and mounting anxiety. Rebecca noticed her distress during lunch, asking gentle questions that Lily deflected with vague explanations about job stress. She wanted to warn Rebecca about the danger they were all in, but involving her colleague further would only expand the circle of potential victims. That evening, instead of going home, Lily drove to the community center in East Palo Alto, where Detective Rodriguez had suggested she might find Thomas Bradley. The retired teacher ran a financial literacy program for seniors, teaching people like her parents how to protect their modest savings from predatory schemes. She found him in a cramped classroom, patiently explaining investment basics to a group of elderly immigrants whose limited English didn't diminish their determination to understand American financial systems. Thomas Bradley was exactly what she'd expected: a gentle man in his 70s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades helping others learn. After his class ended, Lily introduced herself as a financial analyst researching investment fraud. She didn't mention Apex specifically, but described the general structure of Ponzi schemes and how they targeted conservative investors seeking steady returns. "It's heartbreaking," Thomas said as they walked to the parking lot. "These people work their entire lives, save every penny, and then trust the wrong company with their futures. My own retirement savings." He paused, looking embarrassed. "I invested with a firm that promised safe, consistent returns. Apex Capital. They seemed so legitimate, so focused on helping ordinary people build wealth." Lily's heart clenched as she realized she was looking at one of Marcus's victims. "How much did you invest?" $200,000. My entire pension from 30 years of teaching." Thomas's voice carried quiet devastation. It represents everything my wife and I saved for retirement. If something happened to that money. He didn't finish the sentence, but Lily could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't an abstract case study or a collection of numbers on a spreadsheet. This was a man who dedicated his life to educating children, whose modest wealth represented decades of careful saving, whose trust had been weaponized against him by Marcus Sterling's sophisticated fraud. "Mr. Bradley," she said carefully, "what would you do if you discovered that your investment firm was operating fraudulently?" "I'd want someone to stop them before they hurt more people like me." His answer came without hesitation. "Even if it meant losing my own money, I'd want the truth to come out." That night, Lily sat in her apartment reviewing Marcus's severance offer one final time. 6 months' salary would provide financial security while she searched for a new job. The non-disclosure agreement would protect her from retaliation, but would also silence her forever about the fraud she'd uncovered. She thought about Detective Rodriguez's warnings about the personal cost of whistleblowing. She thought about Marcus's veiled threats against her family. She thought about her career prospects after challenging one of Silicon Valley's most connected executives. Then she thought about Thomas Bradley's quiet dignity and the trust in his voice when he spoke about stopping fraud before it hurt more innocent people. Lily tore up the severance agreement and threw the pieces in her trash can. Monday morning, she would face whatever consequences Marcus had planned. But she would face them knowing she'd chosen to protect people like Thomas Bradley rather than protect herself. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would she. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would she. Monday morning arrived gray and ominous, matching Lily's mood as she drove to what might be her final day at Apex Capital. The torn pieces of Marcus's severance agreement were still in her trash can, but the memory of Thomas Bradley's quiet dignity had carried her through a weekend of doubt and fear. She arrived early, hoping to gather any remaining evidence before Marcus implemented whatever punishment he'd planned. The office felt different. More surveillance cameras seemed to track her movements, and conversations stopped when she passed. Rebecca avoided eye contact entirely, which probably meant she'd been warned to stay away. At 9:15 a.m., her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. All hands meeting. Conference room A. Urgent client situation requires immediate response. Lily's blood ran cold. Emergency meetings at Apex were rare, and the timing felt deliberate. As she joined the stream of employees heading toward the main conference room, she spotted Detective Rodriguez's number on her phone screen, a missed call from 20 minutes earlier. Conference room A buzzed with confused energy as the entire company gathered. Marcus stood at the front, his expression grave but controlled. Behind him, a large screen displayed what appeared to be financial news headlines, though Lily couldn't read them from her position near the back. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," Marcus began, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned leadership. "We've encountered a serious situation that affects our entire organization." He clicked a remote, and the screen displayed a series of documents, financial analyses, email communications, and investigative notes that made Lily's stomach drop. Her work, her private research, her encrypted files, somehow accessed and displayed for the entire company to see. "Over the past several weeks, we've discovered that confidential company information has been systematically stolen and shared with outside parties," Marcus continued. "This industrial espionage has put our clients at risk, threatened our competitive position, and potentially violated numerous federal regulations." Lily felt every eye in the room turning toward her. Rebecca's face showed shock and betrayal. Jennifer Walsh, who'd somehow returned from her planned resignation, stared at the floor. Even employees she barely knew were looking at her with suspicion and disgust. "The perpetrator of this theft has been identified," Marcus said, his gaze finding Lily across the crowded room. "Lily Jenkins, would you please step forward?" The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare. Marcus presented her private research as evidence of corporate espionage, her communications with Detective Rodriguez as proof of criminal conspiracy, and her refusal to sign the NDA as confirmation of malicious intent. Every document had been carefully edited to remove context, making her investigation look like a deliberate attempt to sabotage Apex's business. "Ms. Jenkins has been terminated effective immediately," Marcus announced. "Security will escort her from the building, and we've been forced to report this matter to federal authorities for prosecution." As if summoned by his words, Two security guards appeared at Lily's sides. But before they could escort her out, her phone rang. Detective Rodriguez's number appearing just as Marcus had claimed to be reporting her to federal authorities. "I need to take this call," Lily said loudly enough for the room to hear. "Ms. Jenkins, you're no longer authorized to..." "Detective Rodriguez, FBI Financial Crimes Unit," Lily announced, answering the phone on speaker. "Yes, I'm at Apex Capital right now. In fact, I'm in a meeting where CEO Marcus Sterling is accusing me of corporate espionage for providing you with evidence of securities fraud." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Marcus's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly, but he recovered quickly. "This is exactly the kind of desperate performance we'd expect from someone caught stealing confidential information," he said smoothly. But Detective Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos. "Mr. Sterling, this is Special Agent Sarah Rodriguez with the FBI. We have a federal warrant to search Apex Capital's premises as part of an ongoing investigation into securities fraud and investor deception. Our agents are currently entering your building." The conference room doors opened, and federal agents in FBI windbreakers filed in, led by Detective Rodriguez herself. The contrast between Marcus's theatrical presentation and the quiet professionalism of actual law enforcement was stark. "Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for securities fraud, mail fraud, and operating an unlicensed investment scheme," Rodriguez announced, producing handcuffs as two agents moved to flank the CEO. But Marcus wasn't finished. Even as the handcuffs clicked into place, he maintained his defiant charisma. "This is a politically motivated attack on innovative business practices. Apex Capital has created wealth for thousands of investors, and we'll fight these baseless charges in court." As Marcus was led away, Rodriguez approached Lily. "Are you okay? When you didn't answer my earlier call, I was concerned something had happened." "He tried to frame me," Lily said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "Made it look like I was stealing corporate secrets instead of documenting fraud. We anticipated that possibility. We've been monitoring Apex's communications since you first contacted us." Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Every document he just displayed was already in our possession, along with the original context he tried to remove." The revelation sent another wave of shock through the assembled employees. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, her resignation letter clutched in her trembling hands. "Agent Rodriguez," she said quietly, "I'm Jennifer Walsh, Apex's CFO. I have additional evidence about the scope of this fraud, including connections to other financial institutions." As Jennifer began describing the broader conspiracy, Rebecca approached Lily with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry I avoided you today. They told us you were under investigation for theft, and I didn't know what to believe." "It's okay," Lily said, though the betrayal still stung. "Marcus is very good at making people believe what serves his purposes." Over the next several hours, the FBI executed their search warrant with methodical precision. Computer servers were seized, file cabinets emptied, and employees interviewed about their knowledge of Apex's operations. The evidence Lily had painstakingly gathered over months was validated by the sophisticated forensic analysis federal investigators brought to bear. As the day wore on, the full scope of Marcus's scheme became clear. The fraud extended far beyond what even Lily had documented. Over $400 million in investor funds had been diverted through the network of shell companies, with only a fraction actually invested as promised. The rest had funded Marcus's lifestyle, Apex's expansion, and payments to earlier investors to maintain the illusion of legitimate returns. But perhaps most importantly, federal agents had also uncovered evidence of the broader conspiracy Jennifer had hinted at. Regulatory officials who'd been paid to overlook irregularities, other financial firms that had knowingly participated in money laundering, and politicians whose campaigns had benefited from Marcus's stolen wealth. As evening approached and the FBI concluded their initial evidence gathering, Detective Rodriguez found Lily sitting alone in the now empty conference room where her ordeal had begun. "You did good work," Rodriguez said simply. "Without your initial analysis and continued documentation, we might never have uncovered the full extent of this fraud." Lily looked around the room where she'd been publicly humiliated just hours earlier. "What happens now?" Now we build the strongest possible case to ensure Marcus Sterling and his co-conspirators face justice. And you, Ms. Jenkins, get to decide what comes next in your life." As she gathered her personal belongings under FBI supervision, Lily thought about Thomas Bradley and the thousands of other investors whose trust had been betrayed. The road ahead would be difficult. Testifying in federal court, facing Marcus's well-funded legal team, dealing with the professional consequences of challenging powerful interests. But for the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. The numbers had finally told their full story, and justice was beginning to unfold. The trap Marcus had set had indeed caught someone, just not the person he'd intended. The trap Marcus had set had indeed caught someone, just not the person he'd intended. 3 months after the FBI raid, Lily sat in the witness preparation room of the federal courthouse, reviewing her testimony one final time. The case had moved with surprising speed through the justice system, propelled by the overwhelming evidence and the cooperation of key witnesses like Jennifer Walsh. "Are you ready for this?" Detective Rodriguez asked, settling into the chair across from her. The agent looked tired but satisfied, the kind of exhaustion that came from working 18-hour days to build an airtight case. "As ready as anyone can be for facing down Marcus Sterling's legal team," Lily replied. The defendant had assembled a formidable defense, led by attorneys who specialized in making financial crimes seem like innocent business decisions. They'd already begun painting her as a disgruntled employee, motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns. "Remember, stick to the facts. Let the numbers tell the story." Rodriguez handed her a water bottle. "Marcus's lawyers will try to make this about personalities and motivations, but federal juries understand mathematics. $400 million doesn't lie." The courtroom was packed when Lily took the stand. Marcus sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his charismatic presence undimmed by months of pre-trial detention. His eyes found hers as she was sworn in, and for a moment she felt the old intimidation returning. Then she spotted Thomas Bradley in the gallery, his kind face offering silent encouragement, and her resolve steadied. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, led her through the discovery of the fraud with methodical precision. Lily explained how she'd noticed the initial discrepancies, documented the shell company network, and traced the flow of investor funds through offshore accounts. Her voice grew stronger as she described each piece of evidence, the analytical process that had revealed the scheme's true scope. "Ms. Jenkins," Santos said, approaching the evidence table, "can you explain to the jury what this document represents?" The exhibit was one of Lily's original spreadsheets, showing how money deposited by new Apex investors was immediately transferred to pay returns to earlier clients. The classic Ponzi structure, laid bare in numbers that couldn't be argued with or explained away. "This shows the fund allocations for September 2024, Lily explained. Investors were told their money was being invested in a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds. In reality, 73% of new deposits were used to pay promised returns to existing clients, with only 27% actually invested as described. And the remaining funds? Management fees, operational expenses, and personal expenditures by senior executives." Lily's voice carried quiet authority. Mr. Sterling's lifestyle expenses alone accounted for over $2 million that quarter. The defense's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. Marcus's attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Caldwell, painted Lily as a naive analyst who'd misunderstood sophisticated investment strategies. He questioned her expertise, her motivations, and her right to access confidential company information. "Ms. Jenkins, isn't it true that you were terminated for violating your employment contract?" Caldwell asked, his tone suggesting she was fundamentally dishonest. "I was terminated for refusing to sign a non-disclosure agreement that would have prevented me from reporting securities fraud to federal authorities," Lily replied calmly. "But you had no authority to make that determination, did you?" "You're not a lawyer or a compliance officer." "No, but I am a data analyst trained to recognize patterns in financial information. And the pattern I found was unmistakable." The exchange continued for 2 hours, but Lily held her ground. Every attack on her credibility was met with calm recitation of facts. Every attempt to confuse the jury with technical language was countered with clear explanations of basic fraud principles. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, Lily felt drained but vindicated. The truth was now part of the public record, protected by the formal proceedings of federal court. The trial's climax came when Jennifer Walsh took the stand. The former CFO had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, and her insider knowledge proved devastating to Marcus's defense. She described the pressure to hide losses, the increasingly desperate measures to maintain cash flow, and the elaborate lies told to investors and regulators. "Mr. Sterling told me we just needed to get through the next quarter," Jennifer testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said the losses were temporary, that we'd make up the shortfall with higher returns. But it was never just one more quarter. It was always one more quarter." Marcus's own testimony was his final gamble. He took the stand against his lawyer's advice, apparently believing his charisma could sway the jury. For 3 days, he painted himself as a visionary entrepreneur, crushed by regulatory bureaucracy and employee betrayal. He admitted to aggressive accounting practices, but denied intentional fraud. But under cross-examination, his carefully constructed persona cracked. When confronted with evidence of his lavish spending while clients lost their life savings, Marcus became defensive and evasive. When asked about specific lies told to investors, he claimed not to remember conversations Jennifer Walsh had recorded. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, securities fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, the courtroom erupted in quiet satisfaction. Thomas Bradley wiped tears from his eyes, and Detective Rodriguez allowed herself a rare smile. Marcus Sterling was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison in order to pay full restitution to defrauded investors. The judge's comments were scathing. Mr. Sterling exploited the trust of hardworking Americans who believed in his promises of financial security. His crimes were not errors in judgment but deliberate acts of theft from some of our society's most vulnerable members. Outside the courthouse, Lily found herself surrounded by reporters asking about her transformation from corporate employee to federal whistleblower. She kept her comments brief, focusing on the importance of protecting investors and holding financial institutions accountable. "The system worked," she told the assembled media. "When citizens report fraud and law enforcement investigates thoroughly, justice can prevail. But it only works when people are willing to speak up, even when it's difficult." Quote. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas Bradley approached her. The retired teacher looked older than when she'd first met him, but his eyes carried new hope. "Ms. Jenkins, I wanted to thank you," he said simply. "Because of your courage, my wife and I will get most of our retirement savings back. But more than that, you stopped this from happening to other families." That evening, Lily sat in her apartment reviewing job offers from financial firms, impressed by her analytical skills and personal integrity. The whistleblower process had been exactly as difficult as Detective Rodriguez had warned. Months of legal proceedings, professional uncertainty, and personal stress that had tested every relationship in her life. But as she looked at photos from the trial, seeing Marcus Sterling in handcuffs and Jennifer Walsh taking responsibility for her actions, Lily felt profound satisfaction. The numbers had finally told their complete story, and that story had led to justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Tonight, she allowed herself to feel proud of choosing truth over comfort, justice over security. The numbers didn't lie. And thanks to her courage, neither did the system. The numbers didn't lie. And thanks to her courage, neither did the system. But 6 months after Marcus Sterling's conviction, Lily Jenkins discovered that justice and vindication were just the beginning of her story, not the end. She sat in her cramped studio apartment, staring at another rejection email from a financial services firm, the 23rd since the trial concluded. The subject line was polite but final. "Thank you for your interest, position filled." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become famous for her integrity and analytical skills, featured on magazine covers as a, quote, corporate courage hero, and invited to speak at ethics conferences across the country. Yet that same fame made her unemployable in the industry she'd devoted her career to mastering. Lily Jenkins is a liability, she'd overheard a recruiting consultant tell a potential employer during a conference call she wasn't supposed to hear. Brilliant analyst, but once someone goes after their own company, how do you know they won't do it to you? It's just too risky. The whistleblower paradox. Celebrated in theory, shunned in practice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Martinez, who'd managed to land a position at a small investment firm in Portland. "How are you holding up? Saw the 60 Minutes piece. You looked great, but I could see the stress in your eyes." The 60 Minutes interview had aired the previous Sunday, a 15-minute segment that painted her as a modern David taking on corporate Goliath. The producers had focused on the dramatic elements: the secret investigation, the FBI raid, the courtroom confrontation. What they'd glossed over were the quieter consequences. The debt accumulating while she remained unemployed, the relationships strained by months of legal stress, the constant low-level anxiety that came from being a public figure in a very private industry. Another buzz, this time from an unknown number. The message made her stomach clench. "You destroyed thousands of jobs and ruined innocent people's careers. Was your 15 minutes of fame worth it?" The anonymous threats had started during the trial and continued sporadically. Detective Rodriguez had assured her they were mostly harmless. Cowards hiding behind keyboard anonymity. But they still made her check her locks twice before bed. Lily closed her laptop and walked to the window of her apartment, looking out at the San Francisco Bay. The view was the one luxury she'd allowed herself when choosing this place, using some of the whistleblower reward money the government had paid her for exposing the fraud. The reward was substantial, several $1 million under federal law, but it felt strange profiting from other people's financial ruin, even when those profits were rightfully hers. Her parents called every Sunday, their voices carrying a mixture of pride and worry that broke her heart. They'd raised her to do the right thing, regardless of personal cost, but watching their daughter struggle professionally while her former boss sat in federal prison clearly pained them. "Any interesting opportunities this week?" her mother had asked during their last call, trying to sound hopeful. "A few possibilities," Lily had lied, not wanting to burden them with the truth about how thoroughly she'd been blacklisted. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Through the peephole, she saw David Park holding a coffee carrier and what looked like legal documents. She'd stayed in touch with her former mentor, who'd found work as a freelance consultant after leaving Apex. "Thought you might need caffeine and possibly some good news," David said, as she let him in. He looked better than he had during the trial, less haunted by the secrets he'd carried about Apex's culture. "Good news would be refreshing," Lily said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Unless it's another interview with a firm that already knows they won't hire me." David spread the documents on her small dining table. "Actually, it's better than that. It's a job offer. A real one, from people who specifically want to hire you because of what you did, not despite it." Lily leaned over the papers, reading quickly. The letterhead bore the logo of the Financial Industry Ethics Alliance, a nonprofit organization she'd never heard of, but that appeared well-funded and professionally organized. "They want to create a new position," David explained. "Director of Corporate Fraud Investigation. Your job would be to help other whistleblowers develop better detection systems and work with federal agencies to identify emerging financial crimes." The salary was modest compared to what she could have earned in traditional finance, but it was respectable and came with comprehensive benefits. More importantly, it represented something she'd begun to think impossible, a way to use her experience constructively rather than simply surviving its consequences. "How did they find me?" she asked. "Through Detective Rodriguez, actually. The FBI has been consulting with them on improving fraud detection, and your case became a model for how sophisticated schemes can be uncovered by determined employees." David smiled. "Sarah Rodriguez specifically recommended you for the position." As Lily read through the job description, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about her professional future. The work would be challenging, meaningful, and directly connected to protecting people like Thomas Bradley from financial predators. "There's one catch," David said carefully. "The position requires you to go public even more than you already have." congressional testimony, media interviews, speaking at industry conferences. They want you to be the face of corporate accountability. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. More visibility meant more scrutiny, more threats, and more isolation from her former professional community. But it also meant platform and influence to create systemic change rather than just exposing individual crimes. "I need to think about it," she said, though her heart was already decided. That evening, Lily drove to the community center, where Thomas Bradley still taught his financial literacy classes. She'd maintained contact with him throughout the trial and recovery process, finding his perspective both grounding and inspiring. The restitution process was proceeding slowly but steadily. Most investors would eventually recover 70 to 80% of their losses, a better outcome than typical Ponzi scheme cases. She found him in his usual classroom, patiently explaining compound interest to a group of recent immigrants whose limited English didn't diminish their determination to understand American financial systems. Watching him teach reminded her why she'd made the choices that led to this moment. After class, they walked to a nearby diner where Thomas listened thoughtfully as she described the job offer and her uncertainty about accepting such a public role. "When I was teaching," Thomas said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "I had students who were naturally gifted but preferred to keep their abilities hidden. They were afraid of standing out, of being seen as different or threatening to their peers." "What did you tell them?" "That talent unused is a form of selfishness. If you have gifts that can help others, you have an obligation to use them, even when it's uncomfortable." He met her gaze directly. "Lily, you have something rare. The analytical skills to spot sophisticated fraud and the courage to act on what you discover. How many other Ponzi schemes are operating right now because no one with your abilities is willing to challenge them?" The question haunted her through a sleepless night. By morning, she'd made her decision. 3 weeks later, Lily stood in the Hart Senate office building, preparing to testify before the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs about needed reforms to financial crime detection and whistleblower protection. The hearing room was packed with reporters, industry lobbyists, and advocates for investor protection. Senator Patricia Hayes, the committee chair, introduced her with words that still felt surreal. "Our first witness today is Ms. Lily Jenkins, whose courage in exposing the Apex Capital fraud saved thousands of investors from further losses and led to important reforms in how federal agencies investigate financial crimes." As Lily took her seat at the witness table, she spotted familiar faces in the gallery. Detective Rodriguez sat in the front row, her expression encouraging. David Park was there, along with Rebecca Martinez, who'd flown in from Portland. Most meaningfully, Thomas Bradley sat with a group of other Apex investors, their presence a reminder of why this work mattered. "Ms. Jenkins," Senator Hayes began, "based on your experience, what changes would you recommend to better protect American investors from financial fraud?" Lily leaned into the microphone, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Senator, the most important change would be stronger protection for employees who report financial crimes. Current whistleblower laws provide some safeguards, but they don't address the professional blacklisting that often follows public disclosure of corporate fraud." She outlined her recommendations: enhanced legal protections for whistleblowers, mandatory reporting systems for suspicious financial activity, and better coordination between federal agencies and private sector compliance teams. Each suggestion was backed by research she'd conducted during her months of unemployment, time that had transformed her from a reluctant accuser into a knowledgeable advocate. The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering everything from cryptocurrency regulations to offshore banking oversight. Some senators were clearly skeptical of expanding whistleblower protections, worried about creating incentives for frivolous accusations. Others pushed for even stronger measures, having heard from constituents who'd lost money to financial fraud. "Ms. Jenkins," asked Senator Robert Chen near the end of the session, "do you regret exposing the Apex fraud, given the personal and professional costs you've endured?" Quote, "I need to think about it," she said, though her heart was already decided. That evening, Lily drove to the community center, where Thomas Bradley still taught his financial literacy classes. She'd maintained contact with him throughout the trial and recovery process, finding his perspective both grounding and inspiring. The restitution process was proceeding slowly but steadily. Most investors would eventually recover 70 to 80% of their losses, a better outcome than typical Ponzi scheme cases. She found him in his usual classroom, patiently explaining compound interest to a group of recent immigrants whose limited English didn't diminish their determination to understand American financial systems. Watching him teach reminded her why she'd made the choices that led to this moment. After class, they walked to a nearby diner where Thomas listened thoughtfully as she described the job offer and her uncertainty about accepting such a public role. "When I was teaching," Thomas said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "I had students who were naturally gifted but preferred to keep their abilities hidden. They were afraid of standing out, of being seen as different or threatening to their peers." "What did you tell them?" "That talent unused is a form of selfishness. If you have gifts that can help others, you have an obligation to use them, even when it's uncomfortable." He met her gaze directly. "Lily, you have something rare. The analytical skills to spot sophisticated fraud and the courage to act on what you discover. How many other Ponzi schemes are operating right now because no one with your abilities is willing to challenge them?" The question haunted her through a sleepless night. By morning, she'd made her decision. 3 weeks later, Lily stood in the Hart Senate office building, preparing to testify before the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs about needed reforms to financial crime detection and whistleblower protection. The hearing room was packed with reporters, industry lobbyists, and advocates for investor protection. Senator Patricia Hayes, the committee chair, introduced her with words that still felt surreal. "Our first witness today is Ms. Lily Jenkins, whose courage in exposing the Apex Capital fraud saved thousands of investors from further losses and led to important reforms in how federal agencies investigate financial crimes." As Lily took her seat at the witness table, she spotted familiar faces in the gallery. Detective Rodriguez sat in the front row, her expression encouraging. David Park was there, along with Rebecca Martinez, who'd flown in from Portland. Most meaningfully, Thomas Bradley sat with a group of other Apex investors, their presence a reminder of why this work mattered. "Ms. Jenkins," Senator Hayes began, "based on your experience, what changes would you recommend to better protect American investors from financial fraud?" Lily leaned into the microphone, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Senator, the most important change would be stronger protection for employees who report financial crimes. Current whistleblower laws provide some safeguards, but they don't address the professional blacklisting that often follows public disclosure of corporate fraud." She outlined her recommendations: enhanced legal protections for whistleblowers, mandatory reporting systems for suspicious financial activity, and better coordination between federal agencies and private sector compliance teams. Each suggestion was backed by research she'd conducted during her months of unemployment, time that had transformed her from a reluctant accuser into a knowledgeable advocate. The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering everything from cryptocurrency regulations to offshore banking oversight. Some senators were clearly skeptical of expanding whistleblower protections, worried about creating incentives for frivolous accusations. Others pushed for even stronger measures, having heard from constituents who'd lost money to financial fraud. "Ms. Jenkins," asked Senator Robert Chen near the end of the session, "do you regret exposing the Apex fraud, given the personal and professional costs you've endured?" Quote, ... The question was one she'd asked herself countless times during sleepless nights and job rejection calls. But looking out at Thomas Bradley and the other investors in the gallery, she knew her answer. "Senator, I regret that it took so long for someone to speak up. I regret that thousands of people lost money while I was gathering evidence. I regret that other potential whistleblowers are watching this process and deciding it's too risky to come forward." She paused, letting her words settle. "But I don't regret doing what was necessary to stop ongoing fraud and protect future victims." After the hearing, Lily found herself surrounded by reporters asking about her new role at the Financial Industry Ethics Alliance and her plans for corporate accountability advocacy. She kept her answers focused on systemic solutions rather than personal vindication, though inside she felt profound satisfaction at finally having a platform to push for meaningful change. As she walked down the Capitol steps, Detective Rodriguez fell into step beside her. "How does it feel to be an official voice for financial crime reform?" "Surreal," Lily admitted. 6 months ago, I was unemployable. Now I'm testifying before Congress and advising federal agencies. It's not the career path I expected." "The best career paths rarely are," Rodriguez smiled, "but you're exactly where you need to be." That testimony today will influence policy for years to come. That night, in her hotel room overlooking the Washington Monument, Lily called her parents to tell them about the hearing. Their pride was audible across the miles, mixed with relief that she'd finally found professional purpose again. "We always knew you'd figure out how to make a difference," her mother said. "Your father and I never doubted that you'd find a way to use what happened for good." As she prepared for bed, Lily reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared data analyst who'd first noticed irregularities in Apex's financial reports felt like a different person, younger, more naive, but also more purely motivated by simple desire to understand the truth. Now she understood that truth was just the beginning. What mattered was what you did with truth once you found it, how you used knowledge to create protection for others, how you transformed personal courage into systemic change. Tomorrow she would fly back to San Francisco and begin her new work, helping other employees recognize and report financial fraud, advising federal investigators on emerging schemes, and advocating for stronger protections for corporate whistleblowers. The numbers still didn't lie, but now she had the platform and expertise to make sure more people knew how to read them properly, and the courage to act when those numbers revealed dangerous truths. Her phone buzzed with one final message of the day, this one from an unknown number but clearly not a threat. "Saw you on C-SPAN today. Thank you for giving me the courage to report what I've discovered at my company. The numbers don't lie, and neither will I." Lily smiled as she turned off the light. The work was just beginning. 1 year after her congressional testimony, Lily Jenkins stood at the podium of the Securities and Exchange Commission's annual enforcement conference, looking out at an audience of federal investigators, compliance officers, and financial industry professionals. The room was packed beyond capacity, with additional attendees watching via live stream from overflow rooms throughout the building. It was a testament to how much the conversation around corporate fraud had evolved since the Apex scandal broke 18 months earlier. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Lily had become something of a legend in financial enforcement circles, the data analyst who'd brought down one of Silicon Valley's most sophisticated frauds and transformed her personal ordeal into systemic reform. Today's announcement had been teased for weeks, promising revelations that would reshape how America approached corporate accountability. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from a year of advocacy and reform work. "When I first noticed irregularities in Apex Capital's financial reports, I thought I was looking at poor record-keeping. I never imagined I was uncovering a fraud that would ultimately lead to the strongest whistleblower protections in our nation's history." The audience listened intently as she outlined the Jenkins Whistleblower Protection Act, landmark legislation that had passed Congress 3 months earlier with bipartisan support. The law expanded legal protections for corporate fraud reporters, created a federal fund to support whistleblowers during investigation periods, and established mandatory industry reporting systems that made schemes like Marcus Sterling's far harder to conceal. But laws are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them, Lily continued, clicking to her next slide. The presentation displayed a complex organizational chart showing interconnected agencies and private institutions. "That's why I'm proud to announce the launch of the Corporate Accountability Network, a revolutionary partnership between the Financial Industry Ethics Alliance, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, state regulatory agencies, and private sector compliance teams." The network represented everything she'd dreamed of during those dark months after the trial. It would provide real-time fraud detection capabilities, support systems for potential whistleblowers, and coordination between agencies that had historically worked in isolation. Most importantly, it would transform corporate accountability from a reactive process, waiting for crimes to be reported, to a proactive one that could identify and prevent fraud before it destroyed lives. In the front row, Detective Sarah Rodriguez nodded approvingly. She'd been promoted to head the FBI's new Corporate Fraud Task Force, a position created specifically to implement the systemic changes Lily's case had inspired. Their partnership had evolved from investigator and witness to colleagues working toward the same goal, each bringing unique expertise to the challenge of modernizing financial crime enforcement. "The network will operate on 3 fundamental principles," Lily explained, advancing to her next slide. "First, Transparency without retaliation. We've created secure channels for employees to report concerns without fear of professional destruction. Second, rapid response. Our integrated systems can identify emerging fraud patterns within days rather than years. Third, victim protection. We're not just catching criminals after they've stolen money, we're preventing the theft in the first place. She clicked to a map of the United States, dotted with indicators showing the network's reach. We're launching with coverage in all 50 states, partnerships with major financial institutions, and direct connections to federal enforcement agencies. This isn't just about creating another bureaucracy. It's about fundamentally changing how we think about corporate crime prevention. The presentation continued for 30 minutes, detailing the network's technological capabilities, legal frameworks, and operational procedures. Lily had spent months refining these systems, working with tech experts to create fraud detection algorithms that could spot Ponzi schemes in their earliest stages. The technology was sophisticated, but the underlying principle was simple. Marcus Sterling's crimes had succeeded because information was siloed and whistleblowers were isolated. The network eliminated both problems. After her presentation, Lily found herself in the familiar position of being surrounded by reporters. But the questions had evolved significantly from the sensational inquiries about her personal ordeal that had dominated coverage immediately after the trial. Now journalists asked substantive questions about policy implementation, fraud prevention strategies, and the broader implications of transforming corporate accountability. Ms. Jenkins, asked a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, critics argue that increased whistleblower protections will lead to frivolous accusations that damage legitimate businesses. Some business leaders claim this could create a culture of suspicion that stifles innovation. How do you respond to those concerns? With data, Lily replied, pulling up statistics on her phone with practiced ease. Since the Jenkins Act took effect, we've seen a 40% increase in fraud reporting, but only a 2% increase in false accusations. The additional protections haven't encouraged frivolous claims. They've encouraged legitimate ones that were previously suppressed by fear of retaliation. She paused, letting the numbers sink in before continuing. As for stifling innovation, I'd argue that legitimate innovation has nothing to fear from transparency. The businesses complaining loudest about accountability measures are often the ones with the most to hide. True innovators welcome scrutiny because they know their work can withstand examination. A reporter from Bloomberg raised her hand. What about the economic impact? Some analysts estimate that increased compliance costs could reduce corporate profits by billions annually. That's a fascinating way to frame the question, Lily said with a slight smile. Let me reframe it. We're talking about reducing corporate theft by billions annually. The Apex fraud alone cost investors over $400 million. If preventing 10 similar schemes costs the industry even half that amount in compliance expenses, we're still protecting far more wealth than we're requiring companies to spend. The questions continued for 20 minutes, covering everything from cryptocurrency regulations to international cooperation on financial crimes. Lily answered each with the detailed knowledge she'd acquired during her transformation from analyst to advocate, her responses backed by research and real-world experience that gave her credibility beyond her years. As the press conference concluded, Lily spotted a familiar figure waiting near the back of the room. Thomas Bradley, now 75 and moving more slowly than when she'd first met him, approached with the warm smile that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her journey. His wife Margaret walked beside him, her arm linked through his in a gesture of partnership that reminded Lily of her own parents. "Lily, my dear," Thomas said, embracing her gently. "Margaret and I wouldn't have missed this announcement for anything. We've gotten back 87% of our retirement savings, you know." The restitution process actually worked. Behind him stood Margaret Bradley, a woman Lily had come to know well during the victim impact proceedings and subsequent recovery process. Margaret carried herself with the dignified resilience of someone who'd survived financial catastrophe and emerged stronger, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her eyes bright with intelligence and determination. More importantly, Margaret added, squeezing Lily's hand, "No one else will go through what we did because of the systems you've created. That matters more than the money we recovered. You've turned our nightmare into protection for other families." The three of them walked together toward the building's exit, past displays highlighting successful fraud prosecutions and reformed compliance procedures implemented since the Apex case. The SEC had created a permanent exhibit documenting the evolution of financial crime enforcement, and Lily still felt surreal seeing her own story presented as a turning point in regulatory history. "I have something for you," Thomas said, producing a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a brass compass with an ornate face and elegant hands. The back was engraved with a simple inscription, "True North," for Lily, who always finds the right direction, no matter how dark the path. The Bradley family. The gift brought tears to her eyes, not just for its thoughtfulness, but for what it represented. Thomas and Margaret had become like grandparents to her, offering the kind of unconditional support that had sustained her when her own family worried about the dangerous path she'd chosen. They'd been there through the trial, the media scrutiny, the professional ostracism, and now they were here to celebrate her triumph. "Thomas, Margaret, this is beautiful," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "But you've already given me so much just by believing in what we were trying to accomplish." "Nonsense," Margaret replied firmly. "You gave us back our future. This compass is just a reminder that you've helped countless other people find their way too." That evening, Lily returned to her new office at the Financial Industry Ethics Alliance headquarters in downtown San Francisco. The building was a far cry from Apex Capital's gleaming Silicon Valley campus, older, more subdued, but radiating the quiet authority of an institution dedicated to substance over style. Her corner office on the 15th floor offered panoramic views of the Bay Area, a reminder of how far she'd come from the cramped cubicle where she'd first noticed those troubling financial discrepancies. The space was modest but functional, with wall-mounted monitors displaying real-time fraud alerts from financial institutions across the country. Her team of 12 analysts and investigators worked around the clock to identify emerging schemes before they could harm investors, using sophisticated algorithms and pattern recognition software to spot the kind of irregularities that had first caught Lily's attention at Apex. Rebecca Martinez, now her deputy director, was reviewing the day's incident reports when Lily arrived. Her former colleague had joined the alliance 6 months earlier, bringing both analytical skills and hard-earned wisdom about corporate culture. Rebecca had initially been reluctant to leave her new position in Portland, but Lily had convinced her that their partnership could prevent other employees from facing the isolation and retaliation they'd both experienced. "Interesting pattern developing in cryptocurrency investment platforms," Rebecca said, highlighting several similar reports on her computer screen. "Same basic structure as Apex, but using blockchain technology to obscure the money flow. The complexity is different, but the underlying mathematics are identical. New investor deposits funding returns to earlier participants." Lily studied the data, recognizing the familiar signs of a Ponzi scheme adapted for modern technology. The cryptocurrency boom had created new opportunities for fraudsters, who could exploit investors' limited understanding of digital assets to hide traditional theft behind technological complexity. "Let's coordinate with the SEC's crypto enforcement team immediately," she decided. "And Rebecca, let's make sure we have whistleblower protection resources ready for employees at these firms. If this is what we think it is, someone inside those companies is going to notice the same patterns we're seeing." As they worked through the evening, analyzing transaction flows and communication patterns, Lily reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The frightened data analyst who'd first questioned Apex financial reports had evolved into a nationally recognized expert on corporate fraud prevention, someone whose opinions carried weight in policy discussions, and whose expertise was sought by federal agencies. The personal cost had been enormous. She'd lost years of traditional career advancement, endured professional ostracism that made finding work nearly impossible, and faced threats that still occasionally surfaced in her email or voicemail. The stress had damaged friendships, complicated family relationships, and left her with a wariness about corporate environments that would probably never fully disappear. But she'd also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that her work protected people like Thomas and Margaret Bradley from financial predators. Every fraud scheme they detected early, every whistleblower they supported through the reporting process, every reform they implemented represented families who would keep their life savings instead of losing them to sophisticated criminals. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Park, who'd found his own path as a forensic accounting consultant specializing in fraud detection. Saw the SEC announcement on the news. "Your parents would be so proud." "Hell, we're all proud of what you've built." The mention of her parents brought a familiar pang of LSS mixed with gratitude. They died in a car accident 8 months earlier, just weeks before the Jenkins Act passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. But they'd lived long enough to see her transform her painful experience into systemic change, to know that their daughter's sacrifice had protected other families like theirs. At their funeral, her father's union representative had spoken about the values that had shaped their lives: hard work, integrity, and the unwavering belief that ordinary people had the power to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice. Those values had guided Lily through her darkest moments and continued to drive her work, reminding her that the fight for corporate accountability was ultimately about protecting working families from those who would exploit their trust. The service had been packed with people whose lives her parents had touched, students her mother had taught, co-workers her father had mentored, neighbors who'd benefited from their quiet generosity. Many had told Lily how proud her parents had been of her courage, how they'd shown newspaper clippings and magazine articles to anyone who would look, their voices bright, with the joy of parents whose child had chosen principle over comfort. As she prepared to leave the office that night, Lily checked one final report, a message that had come through their secure whistleblower portal from an employee at a major investment firm. The person had noticed irregularities in client fund allocations, discrepancies between reported returns and actual investment performance, and a culture of secrecy around financial operations that reminded them of news coverage about the Apex scandal. "I've been following your story since the trial," the message read. "I know what happened to you, how difficult it was, but I also know that you saved thousands of people from losing their money. I think I'm seeing something similar at my company, and I don't know if I have the courage to do what you did. The numbers don't lie, and thanks to your example, I know I don't have to either. But I'm scared." Lily smiled as she typed her response, offering detailed guidance for the difficult journey ahead. She provided information about the new legal protections available to whistleblowers, contact information for FBI agents trained in supporting corporate fraud cases, and her personal assurance that the person wouldn't face their challenge alone. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," she wrote. "It's choosing to do the right thing despite being afraid. You've already taken the hardest step by recognizing the problem and reaching out for help. We'll support you through whatever comes next, and together we'll make sure the truth comes to light." The brass compass from Thomas Bradley sat prominently on her desk, its needle pointing steadily north. True direction, indeed. She'd found her calling in the most unlikely circumstances, transformed personal trauma into public service, and helped build a system that made corporate accountability more than just an idealistic dream. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the cryptocurrency schemes Rebecca had identified, congressional hearings on expanded international fraud cooperation, and the constant work of supporting other whistleblowers through their own difficult journeys. There would be setbacks, political opposition from industries that preferred the old system of silence and complicity, and the ongoing challenge of staying ahead of increasingly sophisticated financial crimes. But tonight, as she gathered her things and prepared to head home to the small apartment she'd furnished with furniture bought using her whistleblower reward, Lily allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at how far they'd all come. The network they'd announced today represented the culmination of 18 months of tireless advocacy, collaboration with federal agencies, and the kind of systemic thinking that could prevent future Marcus Sterlings from destroying innocent lives. The numbers still didn't lie. But now, thanks to the foundations they'd built together, fewer people would suffer when those numbers revealed uncomfortable truths. And more people would have the courage to speak up when they discovered evidence of corporate crime, knowing they had legal protection, institutional support, and a community of advocates who understood the challenges they faced. The work continued. The work would always continue, because human nature ensured there would always be people willing to exploit others' trust for personal gain. But now it was work shared by hundreds of dedicated professionals, protected by strong laws, and supported by a society that had finally learned to value truth-tellers over convenient silence. As Lily walked through the quiet lobby of the Alliance building, past security guards who greeted her by name and photographs documenting successful fraud prosecutions, she thought about the message from the frightened employee at the investment firm. Tomorrow she would begin working with that person, providing the support and guidance she desperately needed during her own journey, from concerned analyst to federal witness. The cycle would continue, but now it was a cycle of protection rather than exploitation. Each new whistleblower would find the resources and community that had been missing when Lily first noticed those troubling numbers in Apex Capital's financial reports. Each new case would benefit from the legal framework and institutional knowledge that had been built on the foundation of her experience. Lily Jenkins had found her true north. The compass in her briefcase was more than a gift from grateful fraud victims. It was a symbol of the moral clarity that had guided her through the most difficult period of her life and led her to work that gave meaning to all the suffering she'd endured. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly the work the world needed her to do. And tomorrow, she would help someone else find their own courage to speak truth to power, continuing the chain of accountability that stretched forward into a future where corporate fraud would find it much harder to hide in the shadows. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would the next generation of corporate whistleblowers, armed with better protections, stronger support systems, and the knowledge that they were not alone in their fight for justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.